The first time he spoke to me, we were standing in the gravel lot after the Sunday meeting, the air smelling like rain that hadn't fallen yet. He said, "My uncle's oat crop came in heavy this year." I said, "That's good news." That was the whole conversation. The second time, almost a month later, he asked my older brother if he could drive me home from the youth singing in his buggy. I wasn't there when he asked. Nobody asked me anything. And then, 5 months after that, my father sat across from me at our kitchen table, turned his coffee cup a quarter turn the way he always did when he was working up to something, and told me there was a young man from a good family who wanted to marry me. I asked if it was the one from the singing. My father said yes. I said yes too. That is how my marriage began, with 2 conversations I can barely reconstruct. A question that was never actually put to me directly, and a yes that was already expected of me before I had decided whether I wanted to give it. Before I go further, my name is Naomi, and this is Naomi, the Mennonite girl. I grew up in a closed conservative Mennonite settlement outside a small farming town in rural Ontario we called Larkspur, though that wasn't its real name even then. I left 6 years ago, and this channel is where I say, finally, out loud, the things I spent most of my life being too afraid or too obedient to say. If hearing the truth about life inside a community like mine means something to you, I'd ask you to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications, because there is a lot more I haven't told you yet. Now let me explain what it actually means to say yes in a world built so that no is almost unthinkable. People on the outside picture courtship the way they picture courtship everywhere. A boy who notices a girl, a slow unfolding of feeling, a few stolen looks across a crowded room. And there was a thread of that. I won't pretend there wasn't, but underneath it ran something stronger and far less visible, a current you didn't notice until you tried to swim against it. In our settlement, what we simply called the order. The unwritten understanding that governed everything from how long your dress sleeves had to be to the exact sequence of who got baptized before whom, never once said you had to marry young. It never said you had to accept the first serious offer that came your way. But it built a world in which every other door quietly sealed itself shut around you without anyone ever slamming one. Formal schooling for girls ended at grade 8. After that, your education became entirely practical. Canning, quilting, baking bread for 40 people at a time, learning to keep the books for the dairy, caring for younger cousins while the women worked. By 15, you went to the youth singings on Friday nights. By 16 or 17, if a young man started offering you rides home in his buggy or his truck, the whole congregation noticed within a week. By 19, if you were still unmarried, the questions started. Gentle at first, and then steadily less gentle. There was no college waiting anywhere for you, no apartment in the city, no career that wanted anything from you besides your hands. The world beyond the settlement's edge had been described to me my entire life as a place of moral collapse and spiritual danger, and the only door that opened from where I stood, the only one that led toward a home of my own, toward respect, toward a life that made sense inside the only community I had ever loved, was marriage. So when a steady young man from a well-regarded family asked my father if he could court me, and my father brought that question to me on a gray Tuesday afternoon with the smell of wood smoke drifting in through the screen door, the yes rose up in my throat almost before I knew it was there. Not because anyone forced it out of me, because the entire architecture of my life had been quietly constructed, board by board, toward that single word. That's what I need you to understand. It wasn't a cage with a lock on it. It was a cage with no walls you could actually see, no bars you could put your hand on and say, "Here, this is what's holding me." His name was Thomas, and he began coming to our house on Sunday evenings shortly after. That was how courtship worked in our district. Formal, supervised, almost ceremonial. He would sit with me in the front room while my mother moved between the kitchen and the parlor with a basket of mending, never quite leaving us alone, never quite staying either. Privacy in a house like ours wasn't a right you were owed. It was closer to a rumor you'd heard once and never personally witnessed. Our conversations those first weeks were careful, almost rehearsed. He asked about our hay yield. I asked about his father's herd of Holsteins. Once he told me quietly, almost like he was confessing something, that he'd always wanted to run his own cabinetry shop someday instead of farming. I remember the small jolt of recognition I felt. That was the first thing he had said to me that sounded like it actually belonged to him and not to the script we were both following. I told him I liked to read novels when I could find them, which wasn't often and wasn't entirely approved of. He nodded slowly, the careful nod of someone being polite about something he privately disapproved of. I noticed that nod. I filed it away somewhere I didn't look at again for years. By the time our engagement was read out at the meeting, I had spent perhaps 14 evenings total in the same room as this man. I knew the particular way he cleared his throat before he said anything important. I knew he laughed slower than most people, like he had to check first whether laughing was allowed. I knew his family was respected and his father was strict. I did not know him. And standing in my mother's kitchen on the morning of our wedding, pinning my hair under my cap with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, I wasn't sure I had ever been given enough time to find out. Our wedding was a Thursday in early November. The house had been scrubbed and rearranged for nearly a week beforehand. I was up before 5 that morning. By the time the first guests arrived, I had already helped roast enough chicken and peel enough potatoes to feed close to 250 people. The ceremony itself ran almost 3 hours on hard benches, the minister preaching out of Ephesians, the same verse every bride in our settlement had heard for 100 years. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands. I sat very still and kept my eyes on the front of the room. I thought about the oat field he'd mentioned the first time he ever spoke to me. I tried to remember if he had actually looked at me that day or only at the crop. After the meal and the singing afterward, the house slowly emptied as the light went out of the sky, and then it was just the two of us. I want to tell you the truth the way I wish someone had told me the truth. I did not love him on our wedding night. I wasn't even sure what that feeling would have felt like if it had shown up. What I felt instead was something closer to a great quiet weight settling onto my shoulders, like a coat made for someone a size larger than me that I'd been told to grow into eventually. The bedroom was plain, a wooden frame bed, a quilt my aunts had stitched together that spring, a washstand in the corner, no mirror anywhere in the house, the way it always was. Through the window, I could hear the cattle shifting in the barn below. Downstairs, the last sounds of cleanup faded out one by one. We stood on opposite sides of that bed for a long moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, not quite looking at me, "I hope we can build something good together." It was the most honest sentence he had given me since the oat field. I almost cried, not from happiness exactly, but from something more tangled than that. Relief that he had finally said something real. Grief that it had taken this room, this night, for anything real to pass between us. And underneath both of those, the sudden certain knowledge that we were two strangers standing on either side of a bed we were now required to share for the rest of our lives, and that we had each agreed to this without either of us understanding what we were agreeing to. What followed was nervous and tender, and over quickly. Neither of us knew what we were doing. There had been no conversation, no preparation, nothing offered by anyone who loved us except the wedding itself, and the unspoken assumption that something sacred would simply happen because it had been ordained to. We did our uncertain, trembling best with that assumption. Afterward, he fell asleep almost immediately, the way men seem to. I lay awake listening to the cattle and thinking about a girl I'd grown up with, Ruth, who had looked so radiant and certain on her own wedding day, so visibly, unmistakably in love. I wondered if I'd missed some feeling that was supposed to arrive and simply hadn't come for me. What I didn't understand then What took years and a great deal of physical and emotional distance to finally see clearly was that my experience wasn't unusual at all. It was the design working exactly as intended. Marriage in our settlement was never built on the kind of romantic love the outside world takes for granted. It was built on shared labor, on duty, on the deep communal belief that love isn't something you feel before you commit to a person. It's something you construct afterward, the way you'd build a barn, plank by plank. The older women would have told you that was wisdom, that romantic feeling burns hot and unreliable, that a marriage built on compatibility and shared faith outlasts one built on a spark. And there's a piece of that I still can't entirely dismiss. I've watched marriages outside built on fireworks collapse inside 3 years. I've watched couples in our settlement who barely knew each other on their wedding day grow into something genuinely devoted over 30 years together. The system wasn't wrong about everything, but here is what that system never once accounted for. What happens to the girl standing in that room who needed more time and was never offered any? Who needed to understand her own mind before she was asked to hand it over? Who needed even one person in her life to say, "You don't have to say yes yet. You're allowed to wait. You're allowed to want to actually know this person first"? No one ever said that to me. Not in all the years leading up to that kitchen table conversation with my father did a single person suggest that my own readiness was something worth pausing for. I won't tell you the marriage was a misery from end to end, because that wouldn't be the whole truth, and the whole truth is what I owe you here. There were mornings that were genuinely, simply good. There were years when the rhythm of shared chores and shared faith and shared meals built something that, if it wasn't passionate love, was at least a real and steady belonging. And belonging, when you've grown up inside a community as tightly woven as ours, isn't a small thing. It can hold a person up for a long, long time. But there were other things too, arguments that circled the same unresolved center over and over, because we'd never once been given the tools to actually resolve anything. Silences that weren't peaceful but heavy, sitting on the room like weather. A loneliness that was hard to even name because I was never physically alone. There were always children underfoot, always relatives at the table, always the constant hum of community pressing in close. And still, in the middle of all of it, I would sometimes feel something distant and unreachable inside myself, like a room I had locked the morning of my wedding and never quite found the key to again. I left the settlement when I was 27. The shunning came quickly, the way it always does once the decision is made. My family's door didn't slam shut all at once. It closed in stages, a phone call that didn't get returned, a letter that went unanswered, a visit where my mother and I sat across the same table we'd always shared, and the silence between us stretched so wide I couldn't see the other side of it. In the years since, I've been in therapy, which is not a thing anyone in my family would ever say out loud, and I've learned words I never had access to growing up. Autonomy, consent, emotional readiness, self-knowledge. I've learned that wanting to know yourself before you promise yourself entirely to another person isn't selfishness. It's the most basic, unglamorous form of honesty there is. I've also learned something that still catches me off guard whenever I sit with it for too long. I don't believe the people who raised me were cruel. I don't believe my father sat across that table that Tuesday afternoon intending to take my voice away from me. I believe he was doing precisely what his world had taught him a good father does, finding his daughter a steady match, a safe life, a future that made sense to everyone who would ever ask about it. He loved me in the only language anyone had ever handed him. But love spoken in the wrong language can still sound an awful lot like silence, and I spent years living quietly inside that silence, believing it was simply all there was. If you're watching this and you grew up somewhere that made your own yes feel inevitable, somewhere the path narrowed so completely that saying no meant losing nearly everything you had, I want you to hear this clearly. Your hesitation back then wasn't weakness. It was a kind of wisdom your community simply didn't have room to hold. And if you happen to be standing somewhere right now where 2 brief conversations are treated as enough, where your readiness is assumed instead of ever actually asked about, please hear me on this one thing. You are allowed to need more time. You are allowed to want to know someone before you hand your whole life over to them. Wanting that doesn't make you unfaithful or ungrateful. It makes you human. If any part of this reached something in you, if this feels like a truth you've been waiting a long time to hear someone finally say out loud, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. Every week I come back here and say the things I was never given permission to say while I was still inside. I'm only just getting started telling them. The oat field is a long way behind me now, but I still think about that first conversation sometimes. 2 sentences about a crop he hadn't even planted himself, spoken on a day that already felt like it was ending before it had properly begun. I wonder, every so often, what might have been different if even one person had said to me, "This isn't enough yet. Take your time. Learn who he actually is before you decide. Learn who you are too." I was never too young to run an entire household or raise 4 children or put up 200 jars of preserves before the first frost. But I was too young, that morning at my mother's kitchen table, to understand that saying yes to a whole life is not at all the same thing as truly choosing it. And that difference, quiet as it sounds when I say it out loud now, changes absolutely everything. There's still so much I haven't told you. Subscribe, like this video, turn on the notification bell, and stay with me a little longer. I'll keep telling the truth as gently and as honestly as I can. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just be the thing that saves you.